We're just going to interrupt that story now to take you live to Melbourne. The Greens Deputy Leader Adam Bandt and Health Spokesman Richard Di Natale are speaking about Australia's role in the fight to contain Ebola.
A Royal Commission into the Commonwealth Bank, but first I'm joined by our Health Spokesperson Richard Di Natale and our Trade Spokesperson Peter Whish-Wilson, as well as Colin Long, who is the Victorian Secretary of the NTEU. And first of all, Richard is going to make some comments about Ebola, and then Peter will talk about the secret negotiations that are taking place over the weekend that threaten the future of cheap medicines in this country, and Colin will talk about that as well.
Thanks very much, Adam. I'd just like to make a couple of comments about the recent reports we've heard around the government potentially shifting its position and getting prepared to send Australian health workers to West Africa. We haven't heard the government confirm those reports yet. It should do that immediately. If this does indeed represent a shift in the government's position, it's a welcome one. It comes far too late, and it's not of a scale sufficient enough to really make an impact on the epidemic in West Africa. So we welcome the shift in position, but we need to do more, and we need to do it much more quickly. We've got a situation now in West Africa where we are looking at over 1 million people who may be infected with this. The best way to contain Ebola is to treat it at its source, to contain it in West Africa, to stop the spread of that disease to other countries whose health system will simply not be able to cope with it. I understand there are reports that we've got a health worker now who has tested positive for Ebola now in New York. Early reports are that that has been managed appropriately. Let me just say and be very, very clear that for countries like the US and certainly for Australia, Ebola doesn't represent a big threat to the Australian community because it is indeed a function of a failed health system. It occurs because we simply don't have the health capacity to do the sort of outbreak response that's required to contain it. So that's where it occurs, in places where health systems simply don't function. In Australia, we are very well prepared. In the US, I think they're able enough to contain this epidemic, and people in the US and Australia should not be too concerned right now that there may be health professionals returning who have tested positive. The big issue here is if we don't contain Ebola now within West Africa, if this spreads beyond containment lines, what we end up with is a situation where it could spread to the region, where the health systems, for example, in places like PNG simply won't be able to cope with it. And Australia won't be prepared to do anything in that setting if it doesn't send troops now and health personnel now to get the necessary skills and experience in the field. This is a unique outbreak, and without actually having that on the ground training, without being in the field and having the experience of managing this outbreak, we're just not prepared to respond if it does come to the region. So my call is to Tony Abbott. We welcome, if there is indeed a shift in position, you sending health personnel and potentially logistics support and potentially even military support. We welcome that if that is indeed a shift in position. We know there are many, many health professionals who are desperate to go and help, and they're just waiting on you're okay. We know that if we're going to keep Australia and the region safe, the best way to do it is to contain it in West Africa. So make your commitment count. Make sure the numbers are sufficient and that you do it quickly, because every day we wait is another day that this outbreak gets out of control. So that's, I think, absolutely critical. I'll hand over to Peter, unless you've got any specific questions on Ebola. I'll hand over to Peter, and Peter will say a few other words about recent developments with the TPP.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. We talk a lot about Operation Sovereign Borders in Australia, but the real threat to our sovereignty that the government doesn't want you to know about is secret trade deals that are occurring in Sydney this weekend. 12 countries are coming together at the behest of big, powerful corporations like big, powerful pharmaceutical companies to put at risk the laws and regulations in our country that cover significant areas of public interest, such as Australians' rights to cheap and affordable and accessible pharmaceutical medicines. I'm going to hand over very shortly to the NTEU, who's going to talk about their concerns about education and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. But let's say this is the biggest trade deal in this country's history. But trade ain't what it used to be. This is not about putting cows, selling cows, or putting cars on boats or iron ore. This is about corporations pushing to synchronise laws between countries. And as legislators, it's very important that we get to see the text of these secret negotiations. Now, the Senate has compelled the government to release the text of these negotiations, but the government has refused, saying it's not in the national interest for them to release the details of this deal till it's done. But once it's done, it'll be too late for Australians and their representatives in Parliament to change anything about this trade deal. But the decisions being made in secret are absolutely critical to this country's future and to our communities. Now, access to cheap and affordable medicines we know are at risk. It was revealed in Senate estimates last night that the government is using them as a bargaining chip in their negotiations to help get agricultural access through this deal. It's simply not good enough. We need to see the text, and all Australians and all stakeholders need to have input into what is 29 chapters. 29 chapters in this deal that covers just about every aspect of life in this country that's about to be traded away by people we don't know at the behest of big, powerful corporations. I'd like to hand over to the NTEU, and following that I'd like Senator Natale to make some specific comments about the risks to our pharmaceutical benefit scheme and access to cheap and affordable medicine. Oh, sorry, Adam.
Thanks very much. We have a number of concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They range from the breaching of Australian sovereignty, and given the Abbott government's complete willingness to sacrifice the public interest in favour of fossil fuel companies and the big mining corporations, we've seen that comprehensively in the since it's come to power. We have no faith that it would ever put the Australian national interest above corporations' interest, and that seems to be what they're doing with the negotiation of the partnership agreement, where they are simply not opening it up to the public. We're very concerned that the agreement also has no enforceable labour rights. That's an issue not only for Australia, but for the other countries where Australian companies may in fact go and use the agreement to enforce lax labour standards in other poorer countries. We're very concerned in our sector that it would open up higher education to any company that wanted to come in and set up some sort of higher education facility in Australia and just be given government funding to do so, and undermine our 150 years of public investment in universities in Australia. We're very concerned about some aspects of what the TPP might do for teaching, for instance in the health area, where there is a proposal that, believe it or not, medical procedures could be patented, and so certain operations, certain forms of operation might be subject to patent, and we can't see how what the effect that's likely to have on university health and medical schools is likely to be very negative as well. So we have a large number of concerns about this agreement. We want it to be opened up and exposed, and we certainly don't want the right of foreign corporations to sue the Australian government, which is what the TPP and the government is negotiating at the moment, surrendering our sovereignty without any fight. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. I'll just say one or two very quick things about what the TPP means for the healthcare of ordinary Australian people. Put simply, it's a risk to the price of medicines. Consumers are going to potentially pay a lot more for their medicines, and there'll be fewer of them. It's a risk to our medicines industry because it does a couple of things. Medicines potentially will become more expensive and we'll have fewer of them because under this trade deal there is the potential for corporations to challenge our pharmaceutical benefit scheme because they see that as a threat to competition. If we end up with a situation where one of the best systems for funding medicines anywhere in the world, that is the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, comes under threat, what are we giving away in order to sign this trade deal? We're giving away people's access to cheap medicines. It makes no sense. There'll also potentially be fewer medicines because one of the other things that's currently being negotiated are deals around patents and restricting access to data transfer between those companies that do the research and development on medicines. So if we end up with the situation where patents are extended, preventing the entry of cheaper generic drugs, if we end up with a situation where these new class of drugs, called these biological drugs that are now the future of medicines, where entry to new players is prohibited because they're able to retain the data around the research that they do without sharing that, as is currently the case with existing medicines, within a particular time frame, well, we won't get an industry in this country where people can access a broad range of these new potentially life-saving drugs. So it's a big threat. As Peter said, we're engaged in a race to the bottom. We've got corporations gathering around the world engaged in a race to the bottom to see whether we can bring the standard of legislation down to the lowest common denominator. And the threat to Australians is access to cheap and affordable medicines, and the Greens won't stand for it.
Thanks, Richard. Just a couple of other matters quickly. Seeing today Qantas post significant losses off the back of failed ventures or failing ventures in Asia. Workers in Australia are losing their jobs because of bad decisions by Qantas management and the failure of Tony Abbott to step in and help the airline. Australia is on the verge of seeing its national carrier and all the jobs with it going offshore. Qantas is competing against airlines like Singapore Airlines that are part owned by their government and have their government backing them to the hilt. And instead here, Tony Abbott has turned his back on the very important national carrier that's important not only for local jobs but also for our national security. It's time for a change in direction from the government, otherwise we're going to see more results like this from Qantas, and it's time the government got serious about helping our national airline and the jobs that come with it in the same way that other airlines do. On a final matter, it is absolutely shameful that the Abbott government will not hold a royal commission into the Commonwealth Bank planning disasters that have seen thousands of people around this country lose an enormous amount of their money. If you've got a blue collar and you've done something wrong, the government will establish an expensive royal commission to come after you. But if you've got a white collar, the Abbott government lets you off the hook. The Abbott government needs to turn its focus to where the real wrongdoing is, and that is making sure that people who rely on financial advice from professionals are protected. It is absolutely shameful that the government won't adopt the recommendation of the Senate committee and hold a royal commission. Thanks very much. Thank you.
And that was the Greens Deputy Leader Adam Bandt speaking live in Melbourne on a variety of topics, but you heard him ending there about the federal government's decision not to have a royal commission into the financial planning scandal that has rocked several institutions. Adam Bandt describing that decision as shameful. Earlier today we heard from the Finance Minister Matthias Cormann, who said the government